Hello and good morning. Tēnā tātou katoa, no mai, haere mai. Welcome to day 2 of the Financial Services Council 2020 Conference, Generations. I'll be your MC today. My name is Kirsten Young. I'm the Regional Manager of Astron Life, and I'm delighted to be hosting all of you out there in our digital world. Made by the sector and for the sector, the conference has something for everyone, starting with our 3 concurrent breakfast sessions. You have 3 options. The first, workplace savings, in conversation with Andrew Baskant, kindly supported by Denton's Kensington Swan. Your second option, trustees and supervisors, agile supervision, lessons from a global pandemic in partnership with Trustees Corporation Association. And your third option, professional advice, get in shape, the next bite of the apple, kindly supported by Chatswood Consulting. If you have any questions about the event, please make sure you email our events at fsc.org.nz. And please enjoy the show.
Kia ora, everyone, and a very warm welcome. Welcome to the next bite of the apple. I was thinking it could be the last bite of the apple, but it's definitely the next bite of the apple. And this session, in many ways, is a continuation of the discussion we've had really over the last 2 to 3 years around the shape and the face and the impact of regulation, particularly as it pertains to the financial advice sector. And as ever, we have our all-star cast. We are a very warm welcome to Sharon Corbett, to the gents from the FMA, John Botica and Derek Gratham, and of course to Angus Jones. All of these folks have been key partners and key parts of driving the sector forward as the FAA reform turned to FSLA, and we are now not moments away, a couple of months away now as we head into early next year. And so this discussion this morning is very much a bit about, so where are we at today, where are we heading, but hopefully most of the discussion today will be focused around, so what's it going to mean? What's the impact it going to mean in terms of the experience for advisors and most particularly the experience for clients, because that's the design, that's the intent of the legislation. Better advice for more New Zealanders, and there's a bunch of research now out in the marketplace that really supports the value of advice. So it's very much that discussion. Final point before we hand over to Sharon is a big thank you to our friends at Chatswood Consulting. Russell is with us and he'll help us wrap the session a little later on. In terms of the run of the morning, Sharon is going to open the batting, so to speak, followed by the folks at the FMA, John and Derek, and then to Angus. So that'll be a little bit of a set piece each. Questions are completely welcome in the usual manner, and we'll use those questions to help shape the discussion. Once those opening statements have been made, we'll then go into a freewheeling discussion, and we'll then look to wrap the session just before 9 o'clock. So on that note, a very warm welcome to all of you out there. Thanks for joining this session, and Sharon, over to you.
Oh, thanks, Richard. Hi, everyone, and thanks very much for joining us this morning. It is 5 months tomorrow that the new financial advice regime will come into effect, and many of you will no doubt be very deep in the detail of preparing for the new regime. Today, I want to touch on some of the key themes and questions we've been hearing about the new regime, but I also want to talk about the conduct of financial institutions regime, which is also coming down the line. A couple of key messages I want to get across today. Firstly, we appreciate that regulatory change is disruptive and unsettling, and this has already been a disruptive and unsettling year. As these changes are about giving consumers greater confidence to seek out and act on financial advice, I hope that ultimately we'll see the benefits of these changes for both the industry and for consumers. We know that financial advice is really important in helping New Zealanders make informed financial decisions, and it's even more important now as many New Zealanders adjust to their new financial circumstances post-COVID. Secondly, and others on the panel will no doubt echo this point, please prepare early. Make sure your transitional licences are approved, work through how you're going to comply with the Act and the Code of Conduct and how you'll meet the disclosure requirements. Most of these requirements are framed at a relatively high level, and that means you can tailor them to your particular business or circumstances. But that does require some thought from each business in terms of how you're going to comply. So it's important to think about that early. On that second point, I really want to emphasize that the regime is designed to give you flexibility. So for example, there's flexibility in terms of how you structure yourself, such as whether you get your own license for your own one-woman advice business. But there's also flexibility in terms of what you'll put in place to ensure you comply. And this will help to avoid tick box compliance, since it requires each business to really think about what works best for their situation and their customers. But that flexibility requires preparation time. That's why it's really important to think now about what arrangements you need to have in place. An example of that flexibility in practice is the disclosure regulations, which were released in June. The regulations really are a shift in approach away from having a prescribed form whereby the exact words, the exact format, everything is set down for you in law. Instead, the regulations set out the type of information that needs to be disclosed and when to disclose it. But the intent really is to move away from a prescriptive approach, which has led to really legalistic documents. But since the disclosure regulations were released, we've had a few questions along the lines of, do we need to disclose this particular thing as a commission? Or we've had a few people asking where they can find a template for disclosure. So as mentioned, the flexible nature of the regime means that advisors should think about how best to give disclosure given their particular circumstances, rather than relying on prescriptive templates. Generally, we won't be able to give specific advice on questions like whether you need to disclose a particular commission in a given circumstance. The key test is if a reasonable client would expect it to materially influence the advice given. So advisors really need to work through what meets that test in their business. I understand that the FSC has an upcoming webinar, I think it's in about 2 weeks, to work through disclosure in a lot more detail. And it's really great to see organisations like the FSC putting out guidance and really helping members figure out what this all means in practice in your own sectors. Moving away from the new financial advice regime, though it is a topic very close to my heart, you may also be interested in the Conduct of Financial Institutions Bill. So that bill is going to require banks and insurers to treat customers fairly and have conduct programs which set out how they're going to meet that, and to comply with regulations that are going to regulate in the types of incentives they can offer. So I want to be really clear that the aim of the new financial conduct regulation is not more regulation for advisors on top of the financial advice reforms. Instead, the conduct bill is aimed at ensuring that others in the supply chain, not just financial advisors, are also held to really good standards and required to treat customers fairly. So it's looking at things like the way that products are designed in the first place. Are products being designed with customers in mind? Are insurance companies, for example, looking at products that have a really low ratio of successful claims and questioning whether they've really designed that product with the customer in mind? But we do recognise that the conduct regime will have an impact on the financial advice sector. You may have seen some changes were made at Select Committee to address some concerns about this impact. So for example, one concern was that the bill had required intermediaries to comply with the financial institutions conduct program, and there were concerns that this would significantly impact and lead to compliance costs on financial advisors. Therefore, the duty for intermediaries to comply with the conduct program has been removed from the bill. Financial institutions will instead be required to do things like provide training to intermediaries in relation to the products that they're providing. Another concern we heard related to the power in the bill to regulate incentives, and there were concerns that that power could be used down the line to effectively ban all commissions. So in response to that concern, there's now a constraint within the bill on how that power can be used. Basically, if a matter is more appropriately dealt with by Parliament through primary legislation, then that power can't be used, and a ban on commissions would fall into that camp. So we've effectively constrained how that power can be used in the future. We expect to consult on what all of these regulations under the Conduct Bill are going to look like soon. So there'll be an opportunity for further input to make sure we've got the settings right. And on that point, I really want to thank everybody who's been engaged in our many, many consultations over the years, especially in the financial advice regime. It has been 4 or 5 years of intense consultation. It's been really crucial for us to understand the practical implications of the financial advice regime and the conduct regime. So we've really appreciated that. And on that point, I will finish up and hand over, I think, to John.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Sharon, and morena to everyone. I thought this morning I would just start with giving you a bit of an update of where we are with the licence numbers. And I must say how very pleased we are and looking at sort of how things are progressing ahead of the new regime. So as at Monday of this week, we have granted 1,055 transitional licences, and within those licences are included 401 authorised bodies and 7,655 financial advisors. Now that's roughly around 80% of the current authorised and registered advisors we have on the FSPR today. And there's 7,928 nominated representatives. So what does that tell us? That the majority of those offering advice in the sector today are already well down the track in terms of being ready for the new regime. So that's really quite an achievement, particularly when you consider all the challenges that we've experienced this year. It's also evidence of a sector that is already displaying many of the qualities this new regime aims to support. One that is adaptable, and one that is responsive and cares about doing the right thing, and steps up when demands are made of it. So in terms of the shape of the market, so what are the numbers starting to tell us? So I can tell you out of that total number of licenses so far, 50% of those are made up of single advisor businesses. And then the next largest statistic is 30% sits behind, and those are businesses made up of between 2 to 5 advisors. So it means 80% of the market so far is made up of small local businesses. And I think that's really good news for New Zealanders looking to access quality advice from a trusted local advisor. Of course, on the opposite side of the scale, there's been the recent announcement of 2 dealer groups that are merging. So again, for us, it's proof of a regime that's flexible and fit for purpose. And it's one that provides for choice. So that's both for advisors in the way they want to operate and for their clients and for consumers in terms of who they choose to engage. But for those stragglers who are out there that still have not yet made the decision around whether to license as a financial advice provider or to operate under someone else's license, I can reiterate Sharon's call to get ready and to get licensed with only 5 months to go. We're doing our bit too to make sure no one gets left behind. So in collaboration with the Companies Office, we'll be reaching out to every advisor on the FSPR that hasn't yet licensed over the next few months. So it'll be via email and it will reminding them all of their options. So the message is straightforward. It's either get a financial advice provider license yourself or ensure you know whose FAC license you'll be operating under. And we recommend putting some sort of written agreement in place if you're going to operate under someone else's license. And that's either you directly as a financial advisor or if you're going to become an authorised body under someone else's license. But do make sure you get onto that soon. As I said, we're suggesting before the summer is a good time to do it, and that way you avoid getting caught up in any of the last minute rush in the new year. But I do want to make one particular point very, very clear to you, and that is we will be taking a firm line with anyone operating without a licence come 15th of March next year. You will see us taking enforcement action. Of course, it's one thing to apply for your licence, but it's also important to ensure you're actually ready to operate in accordance with the new legislation and regulations. So Derek and Angus, I think, are going to spend a bit more time talking through some of that today, so I won't go into or delve into too much of that right now, except to say that as you've been working through these changes and implementing them across your business, do keep in mind how each piece contributes to the bigger picture. So keep in mind that whether you're working through how to fulfill the new disclosure requirements, if it's the code of conduct, looking at your other duties and obligations, all of these requirements have a purpose, and that ultimately it is to do the right things for your clients. We do need to be clear around outcomes we're looking for. Interests of your clients must be prioritised. You must ensure the advice you give is suitable for your client, and you can demonstrate that to us when we ask. That your disclosure is clear, and you know your client understands the journey and can make informed decisions that reflect what's best for them. Gone are the days of avoiding this by getting bogged down in and with jargon that perhaps you don't even fully understand, let alone your clients. Sharon also mentioned the new rules are principles-based. So principles-based rules enable you to look at outputs and the experience for your client. So it becomes a journey about doing the right thing for your client. But put it another way, they enable you to reflect the real world. Your clients should be able to understand the nature of the risks they are signing up for, and in the case of changing providers, the benefits they may be giving up. You should be thinking how to do this, bearing in mind the client's knowledge and experience. And then I'll touch on, and what about your own knowledge too? Acknowledge and recognise the limitations of your own knowledge. Do you really understand the products you're recommending? In talking to our monitoring team, they tell me that they'd expect to see evidence of the due diligence that you've carried out on products and services you recommend to mitigate this. Derek and I have spoken to thousands of advisors over the past few years, and we know you take great pride in making a difference for your clients through the advice you give and the way you provide it. And COVID has certainly shown us the world will always be unpredictable. However, it's also shown us that we are resilient and that we're adaptable. Most importantly, it's shown the difference that good financial advice makes. This is the time to take financial leadership. It's the time to keep up with the learning and the agile ways of working that we've all become accustomed to over the past few months. Stay open to new practices and to rethinking how you work. Personal relationships will remain critical and crucial. General awareness of the importance of financial advice across all aspects from protection to wealth for consumers has never been greater. And keep up the good work. As a community together, we're all on the way to shaping a sector that's truly ready to meet the diverse financial advice needs of all New Zealanders today and into the future. And ultimately, that's what this new regime is all about. So that's it from me. I'll pleasure in handing over to Derek.
Thank you, John. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be included in today's conversation. Just reflecting the number of committed and passionate people involved in financial advice is anything to go by. It's not difficult to believe that anything is possible. But still, I think, in all likelihood, many of you feel that you have a lot on your plate right now. I think there's a lot to think about. I think there's a lot to do ahead of the new regime, and with all the goings on and all that busyness, I think it's easy to lose sight of what really counts and what really matters, and that's to say what's motivating this important and necessary activity. And funny enough, for that, I think you have to look back in time, not surprisingly, not to the future. It was back in April of May 2019 that the Financial Services Legislation Amendment Bill, FSLAB, had its third reading and passed into law, and the Code of Conduct was approved by the Minister. But even further back, there was in May 2015 that the Minister of Commerce and Consumer Affairs released the issues paper, and you may remember that the issues paper essentially kicked off the review of the Financial Advisors Act, and feedback was first really sought on key issues and opportunities to improve access to quality financial advice. But the issues paper noticed a couple of things. It said that New Zealanders need unbiased quality financial advice that's appropriately tailored to the needs of individuals, families, and businesses. That advice should be available to consumers when they need it. It should be flexible enough to respond to the changing needs of New Zealanders. Now, I think that's really interesting and worth remembering as we think about the journey ahead. It's worth remembering too that the new duties help to ensure everyone can access quality advice and help build confidence in advisors, and that's a good thing for everyone. And although those new duties and obligations are all important, a duty to give priority to clients' interests leaves no doubt as to where the primary focus belongs. It's with the client, always the client. And moving on to purpose, the issues paper pointed the way back then. It's about financial advice that was available, tailored and flexible and responsive to changing needs. But more broadly, how should financial advice businesses respond? What's the best attitude to drive you towards success? How will you reimagine, I think, and even design tomorrow's financial advice business? And I think that's the conversation for today. But more specifically, this is an opportunity right now to look hard at your advice process. One way to think about this, as someone once said, is the same way in which you understand a watch. You have to see it working. You have to observe how people use it, and you don't break it up into pieces. But with all of those ambitions for the future, and now with just over 100 working days until the new regime starts, we expect future FAPs to have been using this time wisely. So it's a good time to undertake a thorough review of your processes, if not already, to ensure your overall approach discernibly meets the new requirements. So aim to ensure that these new duties, these new obligations and responsibilities are deeply embedded in your knowledge systems. While it's not appropriate for me, I guess, to be prescriptive, do put your advice process to the test. So identify which duties and obligations are relevant at the key stages of the advice process, such as at the fact find and needs analysis stage, and the advice formulation and delivery stage and implementation. And of course, what happens pre-advice and post-advice is important and relevant as well. But make no mistake about it. When this new regime starts, time's up. We expect all FAPs to have made strenuous efforts to comply with all the new duties and obligations. I know it's been said before, but it's worth repeating. And I quote, "It's no good telling the FMA what a good job you've been doing about complying with all you have to do. You need to be able to show them, and that involves record keeping and good evidence. What you're doing today will cease to be an option from day one." So when the time's up, as mentioned, we have little patience for the stragglers. This is not the time to linger. It's not the time to move slowly. This is the time for action. And our linchpin for that action is the Code of Professional Conduct. To participate with confidence in financial advice services, clients need to be treated fairly, and professionally, and they need to receive financial advice that's suitable, and they understand, and they have the information protected. These code standards apply from the start of the new regime. And if you take part one, ethical behaviour, conduct, and client care, what do you see? You see 5 standards, a little over 800 words. Each word has been carefully weighed. Each standard has been thoughtfully crafted. So take your time too. Reflect on each standard, for within each standard lays down the groundwork for excellence. And for more excellence, over to you, Angus.
Kia ora, Derek. Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Angus aho. I am the chair of the Code Working Group, And we are a committee of 9 people appointed under the legislation to write the code of conduct for financial advice services. We went through a lengthy consultation process in 2018, and as I always do in sessions like this, I just want to acknowledge all the input that we got through that consultation process, because the code is not our invention. The code is a collaborative effort. So the role for the 9 of us is to write that original code, which indeed we did. We gave the code to the Minister over 18 months ago, and so people have had a lot of time to acclimatise with the way it's written. And we have an ongoing role to maintain the code. So by all means, if there are aspects of the code that you think need a relook or need a bit more additional explanation, by all means, feed that back to us. But we've got the code ready to go for the start of the regime. And so on that basis, I don't intend to go into a lot of detail about the wording of the code and what each clause and standard in the code means. But I did want to highlight a couple of things. And both those things go to this focus on preparing early. Look to the future and make sure that you're prepared early and it's not all a surprise on the 15th of March. So the first of those 2 things that I wanted to comment on is to understand that the code dovetails in with the rest of the regime. MB had this map that they brought out quite early in the development of FSLA, showing the different parts of the regime sitting together. So you've got the legislation with the duties in the legislation. You've got the regulations, and perhaps most pertinently, the disclosure regulations. You've got the code. You've got the license conditions, all sitting together and all operating together. And if there's sort of one central message regarding that jigsaw puzzle, is when you're going around the process of putting in place procedures and thinking about how best to operate under the new legislative package, it's how those different parts of the regime act together and how, in fact, they reinforce one another. So what we talk about in the code about understanding, the client understanding what's being told to them, obviously sits very neatly with the disclosure regulations. But the one bit of the link that I really wanted to emphasize when it comes to complying with the code is the legislative duty to get the nature and scope clear. So to make sure that the client understands the nature and scope of the advice before giving the advice. The code, like all parts of the regime, is shaped flexibly so that it can adjust to different circumstances. And your best way of putting a parameter around what you're doing for your client, so your client understands what they're getting, and so you understand the extent of your duties and obligations under the code and elsewhere, is to get your scope right. So just because we don't deal with scope head on in the code, that's now dealt with in the legislation, can I please ask you to pay attention to that? This isn't something, as I say, to leave to the 15th of March. Thinking about scope goes to the heart of how you design your business process. It's how you design, how you're positioning your brand with your customers. You need to be thinking now about what the boundaries around your advice are, and given those boundaries, how you comply with the code and how you comply with the duties in the legislation. It'll also make complying with the disclosure regulations much easier as well. The second of my 2 points goes to the heart of the code being a piece of conduct guidance legislation. And this is something that is evolving around the world now in the last 3 to 5 years, where conduct is becoming much, much more important. And the big problem with conduct legislation is people respond to it as another piece of compliance. Conduct is not compliance. Absolutely, compliance is an element of dealing with conduct obligations, but conduct is all about behavior and it's all about attitude. It's about getting your mindset right and having your business thinking in the right way for treating customers in a certain way. You cannot comply with this code of conduct by simply responding to it like a piece of compliance or a checklist or a set of processes. You have to get into the heart of how the entire business is thinking. And that starts right at the top of the organization and goes right to the bottom of the organization. You need to have metrics in place to measure how your way of setting that tone and trying to influence people's attitude is seeping through to the entire business and is being picked up if it's not working. On that point, it's also important to notice that anything to do with behavior and attitude doesn't happen overnight. Mistakes are made. It is not credible if you try to say to the regulator, we don't have any complaints, we're not doing anything wrong, we've got it all perfect. That doesn't make sense in the context of legislation that is trying to get you to think about attitude. You need to be able to show where you are, perhaps, if not making mistakes, identifying areas that you could tighten up or rethink what your emphasis is. You can't leave that another 5 months. Thinking about that, thinking about how at a governance level, your business takes responsibility for that attitude towards customers, how you evidence that you're doing that, how you keep a track record of how you're changing over time to respond better to it is crucial in compliance with the code. So in those two messages, I hope I'm getting across that although there's lots of detail in the code that we've tried to make as uncryptic as possible and as useful as possible, there is also this strong thematic driver of use the code in combination with the rest of the legislation, and also think about it as a piece of behavior and attitudinal direction or guidance rather than a set of procedures to be complied with. Thank you very much.
Great openers. Thank you, everyone. Lots of food for thought. As we've been talking, there's probably 5 or 6 themes I'd like to try and tease out over the next little while that are less about the technicalities and much more about, so what's this going to mean? What kind of impact will this have in the New Zealand marketplace for financial advice? And perhaps, John, if I can start with you on that question. We're now 12 months on. What kind of impact do you think the release and the implementation of FSLA, the code, has now had, both in the financial leadership comments that you made and in terms of Derek's comments, the improved access to advice and unbiased advice?
Yeah, thank you, Richard. And thinking about that, I'm just going to just sort of mention, perhaps start with the impact of COVID. And I think that's a really good example of the last 12 months and the way the market has been reforming and what that actually has told us. And I think it's all the positive elements around what this new regime is trying to achieve. So it's putting your customer and client at the centre of everything that you do. So lots of things imploded for all of us through COVID. And you can see there have been a lot of surveys and things out that says that, customers and clients, who have a good, solid relationship with an advisor, weathered the storm through this much better than those who were not advised. But I think importantly, what it's telling us and starting to show us through here is, yeah, we've got a new rule book, so we've got a bunch of there's new legislation, there are new regulations, there's a new code. And not to get too carried away, and it's something that I've been thinking of, and I think lots of others are thinking about as well. It's not so much about the inputs. So it's easy to think about the inputs and create compliance and governance regimes. But when you start to think around what does conduct mean to that? What does it mean around the engagement I'm having with my clients? So you need to start to think of the outputs. And as soon as you start thinking of outputs from what you're doing, then you can start to see how the mosaic starts to click together and the parts of this new regime start to fit together. And then you can see around the platform that says the benefits for your clients, the benefits for your own business. So I think it's really told us that the future of financial advice has never been stronger for what we have on the horizon. And everything we've been doing in these changes the last period actually are giving momentum to push in the right direction.
So just staying with you, John, for a moment. I mean, do you see, great change creates great innovation opportunity, right? Do you see this kind of unleashing, if you like, the creativity of the sector to find ways to engage and address and talk to consumers, or do you kind of see it almost as a BAU, the new rule book, so people have to tweak their processes to comply, or do you think there's a whole new market about to come into the world of financial advice and financial advisors?
Yeah, I think there's a whole new market to come. I think in the very short term, as you say, it might be a little bit more around the tweaking, because COVID has brought to us an emergency situation, or hands to the pump, to do things. But that also tells us we're actually not going back to how things were before. Even if it's the lack of the bricks and mortar, we found different ways to engage with our customers. It's virtual, it's digitized. You can get access to your advisor almost any time, almost 24/7 sort of thing. So the boundaries that we had before have now gone. And the future is limitless as to what that's going to look like. I mean, we don't see a lot of digitization or digitized advice right now as we're coming through, but I think you'll find over the next 12 to 18 months, you'll have disruption, you'll have new entrants coming in to this market, and yes, the landscape will change. With that will come its opportunities, and with that will come threats for certain businesses as well.
Sharon, can I go to you on the same question? I mean, almost as the custodian, you've been there really from the start, helping to drive and shape the FAA review and now FSLA. Do you see this unleashing? Do you see there's a new beginning?
Yeah, absolutely. And COVID really, in its own way, brings a whole lot of opportunity. In March, when we first went into lockdown, I was talking to the likes of you, Richard, and others in similar positions about how financial advisors were just absolutely inundated with calls from their clients wanting help with things like, should I be switching out of my current KiwiSaver fund? Should I be taking a break from my mortgage repayments? Basic things like that. And COVID also has really highlighted, unfortunately, the lack of financial resilience of New Zealanders, the very small numbers of New Zealanders who have adequate savings. So I think COVID has really brought to light the value of advice. So there's an amazing opportunity for the financial advice sector to be there helping their clients and demonstrating the value that they can give, because I think it was John who mentioned those people who had financial advice in March, who had financial advisors, were the ones making the really good decisions. The other really big opportunity, which has already been touched on, is technology. And there were concerns when we were consulting on enabling robo-advice a few years ago that it might mean the end of the human advisor. But I've always seen it as completely the opposite, in that if we can get young people getting financial advice early on in their lives, engaging with advice through an app, then they're probably more likely to be the ones getting advice then from a human a bit later in life, once they've accumulated some assets and want to sit down and have a really personalised discussion with a human. So I see the emergence of robo-advice as a really positive thing, both in terms of people getting simpler advice through an app, but also to that leading to more complex advice situations down the line.
Right. So if I can just shift the conversation a little, because that's a great scene set for consumer literacy. And as Sharon, as you pointed out, and as you did too, John, COVID almost was the crisis that evidenced when people are well guided, well advised, well informed, well educated, they make much more confident, much more resilient decisions, not only short term but long term. And yet again, as Sharon pointed out, and the FSC research Money and You pointed out, 20% of people get advice. Most people are not in a good place. They tend to overestimate and tend to be overconfident about things. So there's this kind of yawning gap about the value advice gives on the one hand, and on the other hand, people's understanding and knowledge and resilience then around their money piece. And yet the solution is obviously get good advice, however you get it, get good information, however you get it. So Angus, I might go to you first on this one, and perhaps Derek to you second. Do you think we have a problem here? Do you have this gap that's kind of unpluggable?
Well, COVID has indeed sort of underlined several themes, digitization being one of them, as discussed, financial vulnerabilities, another. And those things were happening anyhow, but COVID has sort of accelerated it. What we're really struggling with now is, or struggling with, I suppose, confronted with, is reimagining what intermediation looks like. And that's where the value of advice and the potential for the value of advice becomes so clear. Because financial services is an increasingly complex world, and yet financial services is absolutely essential for most people in society. So how do you bridge that gap through intermediation? What are the discrete, bespoke parts of intermediation where different advice streams can offer value? And digitization might be the answer in certain contexts, but in other contexts, you need that human interaction to decode the complexity of the regime. Derek, your thoughts?
Yeah, look, I agree. And I think, from a financial advisor perspective, if you have and adopt whatever that might be, a core belief system about what drives you to do what you do, and if you're a passionate believer about financial resilience, and you are talking to clients and building clients' financial capability, but also their understanding, and ultimately their resilience, then I think you're helping to bridge that gap. So I think it's where the financial advisor and this gap kind of meets together and sort of works through it. So I think that's a key part to it. But I know KiwiSaver's helped a lot, and I think back to my own position, and when I got my KiwiSaver statement, immediately I started to have that thought, like, am I in the right fund for me? And I looked at how much money I'm going to have at retirement. Do I need to save more? All of those things started to signal in my brain that I need to think about things. I need to talk to someone and get advice. I think there are ways in which we're getting through this, but I think this is where the financial advisor can play such a critical role in educating consumers, having those conversations, being bold. I like what you said earlier, Richard, about being creative. And I mentioned a little bit about attitude, and Angus talked a whole lot more than I did about attitude, and I think that's right. It's about adopting the right attitude, and I think this is where financial advisors can make a huge difference.
So we've spoken a little, and there's a theme percolating through the industry that, if you think the last 2-3 years, or a bit longer perhaps, you got banker, thinking about creativity and innovation. You got banker that's helping kids simulate running and owning businesses and making investment decisions at school. You've got the Sharesies effect and the Sharesies generation, which kind of under lockdown ended up being, people were going, well, how do I buy a quarter of my Tesla share, or how do I buy a little bit of Apple, or, and experimenting and being able to actually do that. You've got a number of other initiatives, Invest Now and Flint and a whole bunch of others that are now coming to market. Is this, Sharon, do you think the unleashing of some of the creativity, and is it only corporates that can do that, or are we seeing financial advisor businesses, some of the smaller businesses that John pointed to, that might be able to unleash and capitalize on this as well?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really exciting time. The examples you gave, like Sharesies, are things that technology has enabled, and every business out there can make little improvements, little changes. Even a small advice business is the one out there with contact with customers who can think innovatively about what are the things I can put in place to help customers. That broader question about how we get consumers turning their minds to things like financial advice, there's never going to be a single answer to that. It'll be things like banker getting education out to kids at schools, things like the Commission for Financial Capability Sorted in Schools program, helping build financial capability in the first instance. Things like the financial advice regime, whereby we can build a lot more confidence in financial advice by having a level playing field so that consumers can trust that all advice is held to the same standard. Things like through the KiwiSaver default provider review, requiring KiwiSaver providers to help their consumers make really good, engaged decisions throughout their retirement savings journey. And that might be, for example, through KiwiSaver providers engaging with small financial advice businesses to help their customers make good decisions throughout their retirement savings journey. So I think, yeah, there's not going to be a single way to get consumers suddenly getting financial advice. It's going to be through like a multi-pronged effort that helps us to get there.
Thanks, Sharon. Angus, I know you and I have spoken about this topic many times. What's your read on it?
I think I really just endorse what's already been said. There is no single way forward, but I do think that there is much more imagination required over the next 5 to 10 years than perhaps before. You know, this is a turning point, a point of reinvention, and it's not just in the context of New Zealand and our own legislative change. It is that the expectation that people have of financial services is fast evolving, and advice is at the borderline. It's at the borderline between people and, as I said earlier, this complex world. So the complexity is increasing, the need to access that complexity is increasing, and it needs to be decoded. And a big part of the solution is that what lies on the surface, which is financial advice. But it's, you know, we can't just look at advice in one way. And I think that was one of the challenges for us as a code working group that became so evident in the interaction we had during our consultation, that if you're trying to write a code, you can't just think about advice as one thing or one way of interpreting the world. You know, advice can mean all sorts of different things. So just because one type of advice is doing really well doesn't mean that a completely different shape of advice isn't also necessary or might not also become necessary. So it's having that flexibility, and we had to be really disciplined in writing code standards and in adding commentary to those code standards, not to narrow the world, not to fetter the way people thought about the rules around them, that drove them into an old school way of thinking where you can only think about advice in a certain set of ways. It's about keeping the doors as wide open as possible for what is the best way of treating your client fairly.
So let me then present a problem, and it was a conversation that was in one of the sessions yesterday, reimagining insurance, very much a customer-led discussion. And the challenge in that conversation was, if advice is part of the answer, and take the holistic view of what advice means, and we've got a demographic issue that says a lot of advisors, John, to your SME point earlier, there are a lot of advisors that are kind of making the transition. They have a full book of clients. They now have a whole lot more process and onerous requirements to continue to service and look after those clients. A number of them are looking at what's their succession plan look like. And yet we've got this yawning gap for actual advice, and we don't have the skilled advisors coming through the system to actually take up that demand. So question, John, to you is this question of, if advice is partly the answer, how do we bring new people into the sector to create and meet that demand?
Yeah, it's a very good question, Richard, around because I think to be a financial advisor and to have to have that as your career must be one of the most fulfilling careers to have. So I think in the first instances, we all really truly need to recognise that advice is truly a profession, and with the profession comes the qualifications, which is now sort of where we're moving sort of through this as well. And it's to encourage younger people to get into the industry. And the other is, as I said, there's an expanding waterfront now across financial services. The silos are breaking down. So the silos that we had around product manufacture and how they distribute the product, that meant that siloed around how advice worked. Those silos are now, and I think this is the good news that we have, are now starting to break down. So they're starting to merge through into each other as well. And as you see advice, younger people are now interested. You need younger people to engage with younger people. So I'm hoping those wider demographic issues and things will come to play as well. But I'm really interested in thinking of ways that we can support new and young people coming into the industry. And I'd be really happy, to set a discussion group up with any others who are interested, to start thinking about, are there things that we can do together now today to help make that happen?
I think the answer to that is yes, John. I think that's a great step forward. Sharon, your take on this? Unintended consequences, maybe that we were fearful of a big shakeout, hasn't quite come to pass. But this new generation coming through, how do we sort that?
Yeah, and I've always hoped actually that by some people were fearful that setting a too high a bar would be harmful to access to advice. But I actually think by having a really clear qualification, it means that a 17-year-old, 18-year-old finishing school wondering what to do next can then see it as a possible pathway. It's like, right, that's the qualification I need, just as you might know that, I need to get an LLB if I want to be a lawyer, and it makes it a clear pathway. But I was just thinking, as John was talking, with COVID having hit and this really clear demonstration of the value of advice, we can probably really clearly now, more than ever, show that those people who got financial advice were better off than other people, and that could be used as a platform to really sell financial advice as a profession. So all those young people out there wanting to make a difference through their careers could be shown how financial advice is a way to achieve that. So there's an opportunity for the financial advice sector to really sell itself to a younger generation.
I've got a couple of questions come through on the wires. John and Derek, first one for you. When will the final standard conditions become available for FAP licensees?
Standard conditions, so we're trying to think where we are now, middle of October, early November, so within weeks. So we're just finalising that at the moment. So we will publish within weeks the standard conditions and also licence classes, so the discussion we had around those. And then I'd also add to that within probably a couple of weeks following that, so mid-November latest, we will also launch our full licence kit and licence guide for full licensing. So everyone will be able to see the questions that we will ask and the particular guidance that attaches to that as well. So that'll be quite a comprehensive toolkit. So as I said, a lot happening within the next sort of 4 to 5 weeks.
And while you're on a roll, John, second question for you is what steps is the FMA taking to allow comparison websites to operate so consumers can get access to better information on product offerings?
To be honest with you on that, I'm not exactly certain that we have an agenda item that is specifically looking at that. However, I'm pleased to say there are a number of sites already up and available. So I'm more than pleased to anyone that wants to come to talk to us about any tools that are available for consumers, to open their options to be able to do that. But absolutely delighted to help if everyone needs, any guidance or help in sort of thinking around what they're doing.
Fantastic. Folks, we've got time for one last thematic chat, and I just wanted to kind of head back to where Angus and Derek took us. Because when new systems and legislation comes in, it's the evidence piece, it's the demonstration piece, it's the how do you know piece, and in many ways it's in sporting analogies, it's about if you do all the right things, then the scoreboard effectively will look after itself kind of idea. So I just wanted to kind of perhaps to Angus first, this notion of it's actually the processes that will get us there. How will we know and kind of how do we evidence rather than just saying to the FMA when they roll in and say, tell us about your processes? It's more show me, isn't it?
So it's processes. It's, as we discussed earlier, attitude. But another factor that comes into the mix here is to remember that although in some situations advice is something that just happens point in time, and that's how the legislation is set up, for many people, particularly with that bespoke, connected to your client type advice is a relationship as well. So you can't deal with attitude and relationship purely by process. You need to think more broadly than that. So when you're evidencing, it's not like just your compliance evidencing of a particular transaction. You need to show how those processes extend into an ongoing set of connections with your client and how you manage that to give the client the service that you're promising the client.
Derek?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And I think what's really required to get there, Richard, is that you need to take each obligation, each duty, and sit down and think about what it's really asking of you. What is it that I really need to be doing here? How does it apply across my advice process? And to think, and we've used that word before, creatively think about how I'm going to go about this, how I'm going to show it. And I think people will be surprised in how easy it is to evidence it. From the outside in, it looks like a challenge, but once you get through the process of thinking through the duties and obligations and how they really apply to my business, then the evidencing part is quite straightforward.
Fantastic. Folks, a couple of minutes to go. I'm just going to whip around the room. I'll start, we'll go in the same order. 12 months on, system's been in place. What's different, what's changed, and how are you feeling about it? Sharon?
So if the regime's been in place for 12 months, I'm hoping all of us, government, industry, can be really collectively telling the story about go and get financial advice. This is what you can expect from your advisor. This is how advice will help you make good financial decisions. And once the regime's in place, that's a really easy story to tell. So that's what I'm looking forward to.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sharon. John?
Look, for me, I can't not say it in 12 months' time that I actually haven't had to take enforcement action against anyone for not being licensed. But importantly, that businesses feel empowered. They're no longer afraid of the changes in the regulation and what that's meant to them. They're empowered to do what they do best, and that's engaging and building their businesses.
Derek?
Yeah, well, I agree. In 12 months' time, I really hope that financial advisors are feeling incredibly confident about what they're doing. They can see the momentum that sits behind them with the continual demand and need for financial advice. They just feel really good about what they're doing, and the research continues to back up, as it does, just the absolute importance and value of good financial advice. And I think that I really want to see, ultimately, that becomes the platform to that word we use today of creativity, that people launch from there into thinking much more creatively, thinking much more differently about what it is that they do, how they do it, and move on with confidence.
Fantastic. Thank you, Derek. Angus?
Well, I hope people will be able to reflect and say, yep, I prepared early and I got there in time. But I also hope people will feel open to feedback to us, the Code Working Group, but also everybody involved in the regime, what's working and what could work better, so that we can make sure that the regime works well for everybody. And particularly if we end up going through a negative period after COVID, how it stands up in those situations as well. So getting that feedback and understanding how it works in practice will be most helpful.
That's awesome. I'll come back and just with a few closing comments, but on behalf of all of us out there in digital land, really, really fascinating conversation. I think addressing the future rather than just how do you comply conversation is really where the conversation needs to shift to. And I think collectively, hopefully the audience sees where we're really in for a watershed, great optimism, great evidence of the value of advice. And I might hand over to Russell just to close us out, to wrap us, and just a note from Chatswood Consulting. Russell.
Well, thank you very much, Richard, and thank you to everybody on the panel for your comments. It's been a fantastic session. This could be characterised as something like the referee's pre-match briefing for advisors, perhaps as you look forward to the new regime, and There've been some incredible comments, covering, trust and the complexity and, impact. But I really liked the fact that there was a lot of talk about, the opportunity that with the new regime and with it applying to everybody, that we can now, be confident in that, and it can open the door to, some new creativity. And just to give some evidence of that, I have never before seen a year like this one for preparation. Preparation was an early point made by the panel, and I have seen so many advisor businesses. We've never seen so many inquiries about SOAs, about process, about embracing digital, or about mergers, acquisitions, sales. Advisors are definitely getting stuck into restructuring their businesses. And so I think what that leaves me with, and a good point to finish on, would be to say that I'm optimistic about the state of advice. I think it's got a good platform to, go forward. And after a pretty tough year, especially in the earlier part of the year, it feels to me like that has pushed an awful lot of change, and we're going to see perhaps sort of 5 years development of the advice industry all crammed into about the next year. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what advisors are going to do with this over the course of the next little while. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you, Russell. Thank you, everyone. Main platform is going to start in 10 minutes, but thanks for taking the time, and huge thank you to our panel of Sharon from MB, John and Derek from the FMA, Angus from the Code, and thanks again to Chatswood. See you later, folks.
Thank you. Bye.
What a fantastic way to start the day. The morning sessions have covered a cross-section of topics, from the innovations and training for workplace savings professionals to the unparalleled challenges facing investors and the future of regulatory transition. Thanks again to our valued sponsors, Denton's Kensington Swan, Chatswood's Consulting, and Partners Trustees Corporation Association for supporting these valuable industry sessions. Before we launch into the main platform of political and regulatory speakers, please take an opportunity to have a 10-minute break, have a stretch and enjoy some of the spring fresh air. We'll see you in 10. Hei kōnei rā.